My name is Nancy, and I want you to imagine watching your father's face drain of all color as he realizes his own daughter just legally stole his entire livelihood from under his nose. That moment? It was 10 years in the making, and every second of suffering was worth it. Before we dive into this wild story, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it for you? Comment down below. If you've ever felt powerless against someone who thought they owned you, this story is going to be different. Smash that like button if you believe karma sometimes needs a helping hand, and subscribe because justice this sweet deserves an audience. For most teenagers, summer meant freedom. Pool parties, sleeping in until noon, maybe a part-time job that actually paid. For me, summer meant slavery. It started when I turned 13. My father George owned a corner shop in our neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just cigarettes, lottery tickets, and overpriced snacks. The kind of place that survived on convenience rather than quality. And every June, like clockwork, George would corner me in our kitchen with that familiar look in his eyes. Nancy, family helps family. You start Monday. No discussion, no negotiation, no paycheck. I remember that first summer vividly. The sticky humidity of the shop, the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. My hands quickly learned the burn of stocking frozen foods, the ache of standing for 10 hours straight on concrete floors. While my friends Margaret and Carol were posting Instagram stories from the beach, I was mopping up spilled slushies and dealing with customers who treated me like I was invisible. "Why doesn't he hire real employees?" I asked my mother one evening, my feet throbbing from another 14-hour day. She just shrugged, not looking up from her magazine. "Your father knows what he's doing, Nancy. Don't question him." But I couldn't stop questioning it, especially when I watched my older brother Brian waltz through those same summers, completely untouched. Brian got to sleep in, go to camps, hang out with friends. Brian got praised for focusing on his studies, while I got criticized for being too slow with the register. The inequality carved itself deeper into my chest with each passing year. George would boast to customers about how lucky he was to have such a dedicated daughter. Lucky? I wanted to scream. I'm not dedicated. I'm trapped. As the years crawled by, I began to understand something that chilled me to the bone. George didn't see me as his daughter. I was a resource, free, reliable, and too young to fight back effectively. High school should have been about discovering who I was, about building friendships and making memories. Instead, it became a blur of early mornings in that suffocating shop, and late nights catching up on homework I'd missed while working unpaid overtime. My friends tried to include me at first. Amanda would invite me to pool parties, Rebecca would ask if I wanted to catch movies. But when you can only answer, "I have to work," so many times, people stop calling. I watched my social circle shrink until it was just me, George's register, and the endless parade of customers who had no idea they were witnessing child labor disguised as family values. College offered a brief glimpse of hope. I thought maybe, finally, George would let me go. I was wrong. "Your education doesn't excuse you from family responsibilities," he'd say when I tried to argue. "Besides, this shop is what's paying for your tuition." That was a lie, and we both knew it. My student loans were paying for tuition, my part-time campus job was covering my expenses. But George had perfected the art of twisting reality until up felt like down and slavery felt like privilege. The worst part wasn't even the work itself. It was watching George become more comfortable with his exploitation every year. He'd joke with customers about his cheap labor, winking like it was some clever business strategy rather than the systematic abuse of his own child. "Why would I pay someone when I have Nancy?" he'd laugh, counting his profits while I restocked shelves with shaking hands. Those words became the soundtrack of my nightmare, playing on repeat in my head during the sleepless nights when the injustice felt too heavy to carry. By my junior year of college, something had fundamentally broken inside me. Not broken in a defeated way, broken in a dangerous way. The part of me that had always tried to be a good daughter, that had swallowed my anger and accepted my fate, finally snapped. I started paying attention, really paying attention. The summer after I graduated college should have been my liberation. I'd landed a job offer with a marketing firm, good pay, growth potential, everything I'd worked toward. But George had other plans. "You'll work the shop until September," he announced over breakfast, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. "After all, you owe me." I stared at him across that table, really seeing him for the first time. This man who had systematically stolen a decade of my life, who had convinced himself that providing basic shelter and food gave him ownership rights over my entire existence. The audacity was breathtaking. "What if I refuse?" I asked quietly. George finally looked up, his eyes cold. "Then you can find somewhere else to live. See how far your fancy degree gets you without family support." At that moment, I realized George had never seen this day coming. He genuinely believed he'd groomed me into permanent submission, that I'd accept his exploitation forever because I didn't know any better. His mistake was assuming I'd stayed the scared 13-year-old girl he'd first chained to that register. I smiled and nodded. "Of course, Dad. Family helps family." But inside, something crystallized, a plan so perfect, so poetic, that I had to bite my lip to keep from grinning. You see, George's laziness was legendary. For years, he'd dumped every administrative task on me. I filed the taxes, managed supplier relationships, handled lease negotiations, dealt with health inspectors. I knew every aspect of that business better than he did, including its vulnerabilities. That night, I spread 10 years' worth of documents across my bedroom floor. Receipts, contracts, correspondence, financial records. My signature was everywhere. On invoices George was too busy to sign, on lease renewals he'd forgotten about, on tax documents he'd shoved at me with a grunt of, "Just handle it." The beautiful irony? George's own laziness had created a paper trail that made me look like the business owner. But I needed more than paperwork. I needed leverage. I started with casual conversations. A coffee with Laura, who worked at the property management company, a lunch with Nicholas from the supplier network, innocent questions about business ownership, about lease transfers, about what it would take to buy rather than rent commercial property. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, Mr. Ronald Peterson, George's landlord. I dealt with him for years whenever rent was late, which was often, because George prioritized his own spending over business expenses. During one of our conversations, I mentioned how challenging it must be to manage rental properties. "Honestly, Nancy, I'd rather sell," Ronald confided. "Your father's been a headache tenant. Late payments, property damage, threats, whenever I try to enforce the lease terms. I'd sell that building tomorrow if I found the right buyer." My heart pounded, but I kept my voice casual. "What would something like that cost?" The number wasn't small, but it wasn't impossible either. Years of having no social life meant I'd actually managed to save money. Combined with my signing bonus from the marketing job and a loan from my college roommate Jason, who owed me more favors than I could count, I could make it work. The next 2 months were the most terrifying and exhilarating of my life. Secret meetings with lawyers, careful financial planning, sleepless nights wondering if I was making a massive mistake. But every morning when George barked orders at me like I was his property, my resolve hardened. I was going to teach him what real family loyalty looked like. The closing happened on a Wednesday. I'll never forget sitting in that lawyer's office, signing document after document while my hands trembled with adrenaline. When the lawyer handed me the keys and said, "Congratulations, Miss Nancy, you're now the owner," I had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe. I owned it. The building, the business, everything George thought belonged to him. Legally, completely, irreversibly mine. But I wasn't ready to play my hand yet. I needed the perfect moment. It came the next morning. George strutted into the shop 45 minutes late, coffee in hand, complaining about traffic. He didn't even acknowledge me as he headed toward his usual spot behind the counter. "Nancy, those shelves look like garbage. Restock everything and do it right this time. And the floor needs mopping. What the hell have you been doing all morning?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. My hands were steady now. Steady as stone. "Actually, George, I need to give you something." He barely glanced up. "Can it wait? I've got suppliers calling and—" "Open it." Something in my tone made him look at me properly for the first time in years. He took the envelope, frowning as he tore it open. I watched his face as he processed the deed, saw the exact moment his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. What is this?" "It's the deed to this building, George. My name is on it now, which means this is my shop. And you?" I took a step closer, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're trespassing," he sputtered, the paper shaking in his hands. "This is fake. This is impossible. You can't—" "Can't what? Buy a building, start a business, make decisions about my own property?" I pulled out my phone. Because I'm pretty sure I can also decide who gets to stay and who needs to leave. You ungrateful little... Choose your next words very carefully, George, because I'm calling the police and I'd hate for them to hear you threatening the property owner. I dialed 911 while he stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When the officers arrived 20 minutes later, George was still standing in the same spot, staring at the deed like it might transform into something else if he looked long enough. "Officers, this man is refusing to leave my property," I said calmly, handing them a copy of the deed and my identification. The rest happened like a dream. George's protests, his demands that they talk sense into his daughter, his increasing desperation as the officers politely but firmly explained that property owners have rights. When they finally escorted him out, he turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Nancy. I'll sue you for everything." "No," I called after him. "It is over. It's been over since the day you decided I was property instead of family." George tried to fight the eviction, of course. He hired a lawyer and argued that he had a right to renew his lease, that I was retaliating against him as his daughter. But the law was crystal clear. As the property owner, I had the right to choose my tenants. The lease had expired, and I was under no obligation to renew it. His lawyer actually seemed embarrassed during the proceedings. When the judge asked George to provide evidence of any illegal actions on my part, he had nothing. I'd bought the property fair and square with my own money. I'd followed all proper legal procedures. There was no fraud, no forgery, no illegal activity, just a smart business move by someone he'd underestimated. The case was dismissed so quickly that George's lawyer looked relieved to be done with it. In the hallway afterward, I heard him telling George that property law was pretty straightforward and that family relationships don't override business law. George aged 10 years in that courtroom. Watching him realize that his own laziness and poor financial management had created the opportunity for his downfall was almost worth the decade of abuse. Almost. The real satisfaction came later. I hired Margaret and Carol, my old friends who'd never stopped hoping I'd find a way out. I hired Amanda to redesign the shop layout and Rebecca to handle social media marketing. I paid them all fair wages, gave them benefits, treated them like the valuable team members they were. Business boomed. It turns out that when you treat employees like human beings instead of property, they actually care about their work. When you treat customers with respect instead of barely concealed contempt, they want to keep shopping with you. The neighborhood regulars were thrilled. "We always hated how your father treated you," Mrs. Chen told me one afternoon. "Half of us shopped elsewhere just because we couldn't stand watching it anymore." That's when I realized George hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been sabotaging his own business through his cruelty. The poetic justice was overwhelming. 6 months later, I was locking up my shop, when I saw a familiar figure across the street. George, looking older and smaller somehow, staring at the building that used to define his identity. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been a pity. Then I remembered 13-year-old Nancy, crying herself to sleep because she was missing another friend's birthday party. I remembered college Nancy, watching her social life crumble because she could never commit to plans. I remembered all the times he'd called me useful while calling Brian his pride and joy. The pity evaporated. George had taught me that family loyalty was a one-way street, that my value lay only in what I could provide him. In the end, I'd simply applied his own lesson. I'd taken everything he could provide me, and I'd discarded him when he was no longer useful. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply turning someone's own values against them with surgical precision. As I walked to my car that evening, keys jingling in my pocket, I smiled. Not because I'd destroyed my father, though I had, but because I'd finally become the person I was always meant to be. Free, powerful, and absolutely done with being anyone's unpaid labor. They say living well is the best revenge, but living well on the grave of your oppressor's dreams, that's even better. If this story gave you chills, you're not alone. Just as this calculation doesn't happen by accident, it takes years of patience and the perfect moment to strike. Hit that subscribe button if you believe karma sometimes needs a helping hand, and drop a comment telling me, what would you have done in Nancy's situation? Because something tells me this isn't the last revenge story we'll be covering on this channel.